In just 29 seconds, what started as political discourse would explode into the most vicious on-air meltdown in real-time history. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's composed demeanor would shatter as Bill Maher's relentless provocations pushed her past every breaking point, culminating in accusations of racism, deliberate disrespect, and a studio atmosphere so toxic that security would eventually be called. This is the explosive confrontation that had HBO executives scrambling and left one of America's most fearless politicians storming toward the exit. The tension was palpable from the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the real-time set. Fresh off her viral takedown of Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress, the Texas Democrat had become a progressive darling, known for her razor-sharp wit and unwillingness to back down from any fight. Tonight, she was here to discuss voting rights legislation. But Bill Maher had other plans. As the cameras rolled, Maher's opening was deceptively casual, that trademark smirk already playing at the corners of his mouth. "So, Congresswoman, you've been making quite the name for yourself with these dramatic moments in Congress. Some might say you're more interested in going viral than actually governing." Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I think what you called dramatic, Bill, most people would call holding my colleagues accountable for their lies and racist attacks. When Marjorie Taylor Greene questions my intelligence and calls me names, I'm not going to sit there and take it." Right. Maher nodded, but his tone carried that condescending edge his regular viewers knew all too well. "But don't you think sometimes these theatrics distract from the real work? I mean, you're spending more time in viral clips than in committee rooms actually writing legislation." The first flash of genuine irritation crossed Crockett's face. "Theatrics? Is that what we're calling it when a black woman refuses to be disrespected? Because I've authored 12 pieces of legislation this term, Bill. How many have you written?" Maher chuckled, that laugh that had infuriated guests for decades. "Well, I'm not in Congress, but I am trying to have an honest conversation about whether your approach is helping or hurting your cause." "My cause?" Crockett leaned forward slightly. "You mean civil rights? Voting rights? Making sure people who look like me aren't gerrymandered out of existence? Those causes?" "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about," Maher said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone. "Everything becomes about race with you people. Can't we just discuss policy without making it about identity politics?" The studio fell dead silent. Even the audience seemed to sense they'd just witnessed a line being crossed. Crockett's expression didn't change immediately, but something shifted in her eyes, a hardening that anyone who'd watched her congressional hearings would recognize as dangerous territory. "You people?" she repeated slowly, each word measured and deliberate. "Did you just say, 'you people' to me, on national television?" Maher's face flushed slightly, but he doubled down with typical arrogance. "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive." "You know what I meant. Politicians who make everything about race instead of focusing on real solutions." "Sensitive?" Crockett's voice rose for the first time, and the controlled fury in it made several audience members shift uncomfortably. "You just dismissed my legitimate concerns about voter suppression as identity politics, then had the audacity to say 'you people' to a black congresswoman discussing civil rights. And I'm being sensitive?" The other panelists, a nervous-looking Republican strategist and a liberal columnist, exchanged glances, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. This wasn't the usual political sparring they'd signed up for. This was becoming something much more personal and volatile. Maher, sensing he was losing control of his own show, tried to regain his footing with humor, always his default defense mechanism. "Look, I think we're getting a little heated here over a misunderstanding. Maybe we should talk about something else." "Oh no," Crockett shot back, her voice now carrying the full weight of her prosecutorial background. "We're not moving on from this. You brought me on this show to discuss voting rights, then immediately questioned my competence, dismissed my lived experience as theatrics, and used language that every black person in America recognizes as coded racism. And now you want to just move on?" The camera caught Maher's jaw tightening, his famous composure starting to crack under Crockett's relentless logic. He wasn't used to guests who could match his intellectual aggression and weren't intimidated by his platform. "I think you're reading way too much into this," Maher said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I'm trying to have a substantive conversation about effective governance. And you're making it about what, Bill? Crockett interrupted, leaning forward in her chair. Say it. You're trying to have a conversation about what exactly? The pause stretched uncomfortably long. In that silence, everyone in the studio could feel the temperature rising. Maher's face was reddening. Whether from embarrassment or anger was unclear, but his next words would prove it was definitely the latter. Fine. You want to know what I think? Maher's voice took on an edge that his longtime viewers rarely heard. I think you and politicians like you use accusations of racism as a shield to avoid legitimate criticism. It's intellectually dishonest, and it's exactly why we can't have real conversations in this country anymore. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Crockett sat back in her chair, a smile spreading across her face that somehow managed to be both beautiful and terrifying. It was the smile she'd worn right before eviscerating witnesses in congressional hearings. And everyone who knew her political reputation understood that Maher had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. But this was only the beginning of what would become the most explosive confrontation in real-time history. As Crockett prepared to unleash years of pent-up frustration at being tone-policed, dismissed, and condescended to by men who looked exactly like Bill Maher. Intellectually dishonest? Crockett's voice was now steel wrapped in silk, each word precisely enunciated with the kind of controlled rage that made seasoned politicians nervous. Let me tell you what's intellectually dishonest, Bill. What's intellectually dishonest is a privileged white man sitting in his comfortable HBO studio, telling a black woman from the South, who's lived through actual voter suppression, who's seen her grandmother's polling place shut down, who's watched her community's districts carved up like a damn turkey, that her concerns about racism are just political theater. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Even Maher seemed momentarily stunned by the raw fury in her voice. But Crockett was just getting started. You want to talk about shields? Let's talk about your shield, Bill. Your shield of, I'm just asking tough questions, when what you're really doing is perpetuating the same dismissive bullshit that black women face every single day. You think because you donate to Democratic candidates and make jokes about Trump, that you get a free pass to question my competence and my motives? Maher tried to interject. Now wait a minute. No, you wait a fucking minute. The curse word cracked through the studio like a whip, and several audience members audibly gasped. For 30 years, you've built your career on being the provocative truth-teller, right? Well, here's some truth for you. You're not edgy, you're not brave, and you're certainly not speaking truth to power when you're punching down at a black congresswoman for having the audacity to call out racism when she sees it. The camera caught Maher's face, cycling through several emotions: shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of this kind of verbal assault, especially not from someone who could match his rhetorical skills blow for blow. I think you're completely mischaracterizing what I said, Maher managed, but his voice had lost its commanding presence. I never questioned your competence. Bullshit. Crockett slammed her hand on the desk, the sound reverberating through the studio like a gunshot. You opened this conversation by suggesting I was more interested in going viral than governing. You called my defense of my own dignity theatrics. You told me I was being sensitive for objecting to racist language. And now you're going to sit there and gaslight me about what just came out of your own mouth? The Republican strategist looked like he wanted to crawl under his chair, while the liberal columnist seemed torn between fascination and horror at watching one of television's most powerful hosts getting systematically dismantled on his own show. Maher's face was now fully flushed, his famous composure completely shattered. You know what? Maybe this is exactly the problem. You can't handle any criticism without crying racism. It's like arguing with a child who screams every time they don't get their way. The moment those words left Maher's mouth, everyone in the studio knew he'd made a fatal error. Comparing a sitting congresswoman to a screaming child was bad enough, but doing it to a black woman in the context of a discussion about racism was career suicide-level stupidity. Crockett went very still, the kind of stillness that predators exhibit right before they strike. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried such menace that it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Did you just call me a child, Bill? I didn't call you, I said you were acting like... Maher stammered, finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake. No. Crockett shook her head slowly, that terrifying smile returning. You said it. On camera. In front of millions of people. You just called the black congresswoman a child because she had the audacity to call out your racist language. Do you understand what you just did? The silence stretched so long that the director was probably wondering if they'd lost audio. Maher's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, searching for words that might somehow undo what he'd just said. Let me help you understand, Crockett continued, rising slightly in her chair. What you just did is exactly what white supremacists have done to black women for centuries. Infantilize us. Dismiss our legitimate concerns as emotional outbursts. Suggest that we're too immature, too irrational, too sensitive to engage in serious political discourse. And you did it because I wouldn't let you get away with your casual racism disguised as intellectual rigor. Maher finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak protest. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I would have said the same thing to any guest who was being unreasonable. Unreasonable? Crockett's laugh was sharp and bitter. I'm being unreasonable for expecting basic respect? For expecting that when I come on your show to discuss voter suppression, something that directly affects my constituents, you won't immediately question my motives and competence? That you won't use coded racist language and then act like I'm crazy for recognizing it? The other panelists had completely given up any pretense of participating in the discussion. This had become a two-person gladiator match, and everyone else in the studio was just trying to stay out of the blast radius. You're putting words in my mouth, Maher said desperately. I never used any racist language. You people isn't racist language? Crockett shot back instantly. Dismissing concerns about voter suppression as identity politics isn't racist? Suggesting that black politicians who talk about race are being divisive isn't racist? What fucking planet are you living on, Bill? The cursing was becoming more frequent now, each profanity delivered with surgical precision for maximum impact. The studio audience was completely silent, witnessing what felt less like a political debate and more like a public execution. Maher's desperation was becoming palpable. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Wrong foot? Crockett's voice rose to a roar that seemed to shake the cameras. Wrong foot? You disrespected me from the moment I sat down. Questioned my competence. Used racist language. Gaslit me about it. And then called me a child when I refused to accept your bullshit. And you think we just got off on the wrong foot? The transformation was complete. The composed Congresswoman who had walked onto the set had been replaced by a force of nature. Years of accumulated rage at being dismissed, condescended to, and disrespected by men like Maher finally finding its target. But even this volcanic eruption was just building toward an even more explosive climax that would leave Maher's reputation in ruins and HBO executives scrambling to contain the fallout. Maher made one last desperate attempt to regain control of his own show. Congresswoman, I think we need to take a step back here and, don't you dare try to manage me now. Crockett cut him off with such ferocity that Maher actually recoiled in his chair. You want to know what this is really about, Bill? This isn't about policy disagreements or intellectual debate. This is about your fucking ego. You can't handle that a black woman from Texas is smarter than you, more articulate than you, and isn't intimidated by your little HBO kingdom. The cameras captured every micro-expression on Maher's face as he realized he was being eviscerated on live television by someone who had completely outmaneuvered him. His usual arsenal of smirks, quips, and condescending chuckles had been rendered useless against Crockett's surgical precision. That's absolutely ridiculous, Maher started weakly. Is it? Crockett leaned forward, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier shouting. Let me tell you what I see, Bill. I see a man who's built his entire career on being the smartest guy in the room, and he's absolutely losing his shit because tonight, he's not even the smartest person at this table. The studio audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was a public psychological dissection being performed by a master. You brought me on this show because you thought I'd be another easy target, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. Another angry black woman you could bait into losing her temper so you could look reasonable by comparison. But you fucked around with the wrong one tonight, didn't you? Maher's face was now a deep shade of red. Whether from embarrassment or rage was impossible to tell. You're completely out of line. Out of line? Crockett exploded, rising partially from her chair. I'm out of line? You spent this entire interview disrespecting me, questioning my competence, using racist language, and treating me like I'm some kind of political prop for your entertainment. And I'm out of line for calling you on your bullshit? The other panelists looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. The Republican strategist was staring at his hands, while the liberal columnist seemed to be taking notes, probably already crafting his think piece about witnessing the death of civil discourse on live television. Look, maybe we should just agree to disagree and move on to other topics, Maher said, his voice now carrying a note of genuine panic. Crockett's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, now you want to move on? Now that you've shown your entire audience exactly who you are, now you want to change the subject? That's not how this works, Bill. She stood up fully now, and the action seemed to dwarf everyone else at the table despite her relatively small stature. There was something about her presence in that moment that commanded the entire studio. Let me be crystal clear about something, Crockett said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing Congress. I didn't come here to be your token black guest that you could lecture about how to properly discuss racism. I didn't come here to be talked down to by a man who thinks his liberal credentials give him permission to question my lived experiences. Maher tried one more time to salvage the situation. Congresswoman, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. There's been no misunderstanding, Crockett shot back immediately. You understood exactly what you were doing when you brought me on here. You wanted to put me in my place, didn't you? Show your audience that even these uppity black politicians from Congress couldn't handle a real intellectual challenge from Bill Maher. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. But here's what you didn't count on, Crockett continued, her voice now carrying a tone of grim satisfaction. You didn't count on me being smarter than you. You didn't count on me seeing through your bullshit immediately. And you sure as hell didn't count on me having the backbone to call you out on national television. Maher's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his television career, Bill Maher was completely speechless. So, let me make this easy for you, Bill, Crockett said, reaching down to remove her microphone with deliberate slowness. Since you clearly brought me here as some kind of political zoo animal for your audience's entertainment, and since you've made it abundantly clear that you have no interest in treating me with basic human respect, I'm going to save us both some time. The microphone hit the table with a sharp crack that echoed through the studio like a gunshot. I'm done with this bullshit, Crockett declared, her voice now filling the entire studio without any electronic amplification. And I'm done with privileged white men like you who think they can hide their racism behind fake intellectual superiority. She stepped back from the table, and every camera in the studio followed her movement. The audience was completely silent, mesmerized by the raw power of the moment. You want to know what's really intellectually dishonest, Bill? Crockett asked, gathering her purse with the casual confidence of someone who knew she'd just won a war. What's intellectually dishonest is pretending that this conversation was ever about policy or governance. This was about you trying to put a black woman in her place, and failing spectacularly. Maher finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate croak. Congresswoman, please, let's just... No, Crockett cut him off one final time, her voice carrying such finality that it seemed to echo off the studio walls. We're done here. You've shown your audience exactly who you are tonight, Bill. A racist, condescending bully who can't handle being challenged by someone he considers beneath him. She turned toward the exit, then paused and looked back at Maher one last time. And for the record, the only person who embarrassed themselves tonight was you. With that, Jasmine Crockett walked off the real-time set, leaving behind a stunned studio, a humiliated host, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. The cameras lingered on Maher's face as he sat in complete silence, his usual bravado replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had just been thoroughly outclassed on his own show. The episode would end in awkward silence, with Maher unable to recover his composure for the remainder of the broadcast. HBO executives would spend the next several hours in emergency meetings, while social media exploded with clips of Crockett's devastating takedown. The Congresswoman had walked into Maher's studio as a guest and walked out as a legend, having delivered one of the most masterful verbal destructions in television history. In the end, Maher had gotten exactly what he'd asked for, a fiery confrontation that would generate massive attention. He just hadn't counted on being the one left in ashes.